Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to those who are joining us online and to those who are in the room with us. If you have questions as we go about this, please throw them up in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself. You're automatically muted when you came in the room. Hopefully everybody can hear me. If at any point, we've got sort of a complex AV setup here. If at any point something drops out, you can't hear me, you can't see my screen, please let me know. We'll pause and we'll get it fixed. This is another installment in our Dawn of the Data Age lecture series. So far, I've been trying to keep these around 45 minutes, and they've routinely gone to an hour. So I have intentionally restricted myself on the number of slides we're going to go over today. But the basic progression is going to start with the fastest, easiest ways to calculate customer lifetime value and customer value. And I will make the differentiation for you between those two metrics because they are different. And gradually build throughout the lecture to what are some of the most advanced methods that are being used, mostly by e-commerce sites. They seem to be the ones who are really pioneering this approach. I believe that that's because of the easy availability of data, not necessarily because this is a metric only for e-commerce. This works just as well for B2B, any sort of B2C, even if it's a service or product, physical product, that is purchased in person. This is still one of those fundamental economic values that every business should understand. And I have to be honest that I'm a little shocked that in 2017, this is not a metric that most people know off the top of their head when it comes to their own business. Everybody sort of has an idea, but no one really seems to have a hard number. And it's unfortunate because as far as single metrics usefulness goes, this is really possibly at the top of the list. This allows you to optimize marketing spend. Right? You can make rational cost of acquisition decisions if you understand customer lifetime value. This helps with sales prioritization and upselling. If you know who are the likely customers to convert, what they're likely to purchase, and those are higher value purchases for you, you can prioritize your scarce resources with your sales team. This is great for product development. You often want to listen to your highest value customers if you're going to be changing your product or rolling something new out. And with churn. Especially with churn. And it seems that that's the one that has really catapulted this metric into people's perceptions, is its usefulness for understanding should we allow a customer to churn or not. And we'll get to this in a few slides, but as a quick preview, about 50% of churn is unavoidable. You're just never going to stop it no matter what you do. There's no interception that you can do to stop it. Knowing that is very important because then you don't chase down retention leads that aren't going to stay. And then for those who are likely to stay, you can prioritize your intervention activities. For those who don't know or are first joining this lecture series, I'm Luciano. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Emperitas. We're a team of economists and data scientists delivering bi-weekly customer lifetime value intelligence so our clients can beat their competitors for the most profitable customers. I myself am a PhD in econ. I also have my master's in economics, and one of my specializations is econometrics, and so this is how we really got into customer lifetime value analytics. I'm also the founder and director of research at the Utah Community Research Group at the University of Utah, where I teach microeconomics, data science, applied research, and American economic history. The three pieces of our lecture today are going to start first with finding average customer lifetime value. This is the baseline from which you need to start basing decisions. It's not particularly hard to find the average CLV. I'm going to show you a rapid way. You could probably by the end of today know your average customer value. And if you have a sense of past churn, it's pretty easy to quickly figure out your average. That's not a very useful metric long-term because of the Pareto principle and other things we've covered in past lectures. That Pareto principle stating that 80% of your customer lifetime value is going to be derived from 20% of your actual customers. So 1 in 5 is extremely high value. So they're not even close to the average. And part of what can go into that, and this gets to the second portion of what we'll cover today, are the non-monetary components of customer lifetime value. And this is really based on, I would say, recommendation and understanding consumer surplus, how much more value a customer is deriving than what they actually pay, because your lifetime value calculations are going to largely be based on observational transactional data, what they actually paid. That says nothing about what they're actually willing to pay. And understanding the difference between what they pay and their willingness to pay while it does have a monetary value, really it comes down to how are you going to improve the experience for that customer to capture some of that value. And that's why we consider it non-monetary. It has to be, you have to monetize it through actual behavior, knowing it doesn't just change the value. And then the last is to move you beyond this average CLV and, oh, someone joined. Hope we didn't lose it. There we go. To move you beyond average CLV to individualized CLV. And this is where the e-commerce companies have really dominated other organizations in their use of this metric, is getting down to those really individual level understandings of value. Again, I really like to just answer questions as I go along rather than wait till the very end and have a Q&A session. You can throw those questions up in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself and ask. I would encourage you to introduce yourself since we have so many people joining today, and some are joining by phone, so we can't see your name. So finding average CLV. This is something, like I said, you can probably do today. If you don't know this metric, then I'd challenge you. By the end of today, or maybe tomorrow, give yourself a little bit of time, you can figure this out by going to your finance department. So let's define what is meant by both customer value and then customer lifetime value and how they differ. Because there is a very big difference between them. Customer value is everything to this point. So it's going to use historical data, but it's everything to this point. It doesn't take into consideration the lifetime component. Lifetime means that there is a birth, a clear birth, and a clear death date. And while that might seem conceptually very easy, what you'll find as you dig into your data, it's very hard to actually understand lifespan. And that's in part because if you're new, or if your company is new and you don't have a lot of historical data, and people haven't really churned out yet, customers haven't churned out yet, it can be hard to nail down what that lifetime value is, because it requires you to predict into the future. It's not good enough to just look at your historical data. If you're going to talk about lifetime, there's a birth, there's a death. Those who are living have a component of value that you have not captured yet in your historical data. So you have to infer it through predictive modeling. That's why it's so easy to get to customer value compared to customer lifetime value. And let me just show you how easy that really is. Part of what you have to decide as you go into making these calculations is what are you going to use as the basis for value? Is it going to be revenue or profit? Those are really the economic decisions you have to make. And they have pros and cons. Now, I'm not saying that one is necessarily better. I maybe am a little biased because of my econ background. If I ever get backed into a corner on an econ question, I just shout out the word profit because 95% of the time, that's the correct answer. Profit is ultimately what is going to make your company grow and survive. But if it's very volatile, and many e-commerce companies in particular have experienced this where quarter by quarter, there's so much volatility in the profit margin that using profit as the basis can lead to really inconsistent and wildly inaccurate predictive models. And so you have to sometimes fall back on revenue. The benefit of profit over revenue is that it is a net metric. It captures everything that's not just about the income that the customer brings you, but also the costs related to servicing that customer. And so I'd encourage you to try to look at both metrics as a basis for your value calculations, and then just consider volatility, consider the cost of acquisition, and in the end, you have to use something that can scale, that can be used quickly, and you will just have to make the decision, are you going to use revenue or are you going to use profit? And usually if you're using profit, it's gross profit margin. I said there's a quick and dirty, easy way to get to this, and here it is. This is what you should be able to accomplish by the end of this week. All you have to do is take your annual revenue, or your gross margin if that's what you decide to use, and divide it by the number of customers for each year. And you can do this year over year, and it will give you a rough sense. You have 10 customers one year, you had $100 in revenue. The next year you have 9 customers, you have $110 revenue. The next year you have 15 customers, you have $170 in revenue. That would allow you year by year to get a sense of the customer value. It's a good starting estimate, but it does not take lifetime into consideration. You don't actually know which customers were there in year 1, year 2, year 3. You just get these total numbers. And as I've pointed out in past lectures, I believe this was in the Interpreting Data Like a Pro lecture, average values can be extremely misleading. And the example I gave in that, and I'll repeat it here, is because we'll talk about Net Promoter Score as a non-monetary component to include in your customer lifetime value calculations. If you had 2 customers, and on a 0 to 10 scale, which is what Net Promoter Score is always measured on, you say, how likely are you to recommend our company to your friends, colleagues, and family? And one customer tells you 0, meaning that they are extremely unlikely to ever recommend you. And another customer tells you 10. They're extremely likely to recommend you. And you take the average of that. Well, 0 plus 10 divided by 2 is 5. So you would look at that and say, we have an average net promoter, or in this case, likelihood to recommend. We have a likelihood of recommendation of about 5. And that really misses the actual pattern that's going on, because no one was 5. You had one person who will never recommend you, and you have one person who will highly recommend you. And that is lost in averages. And this is why in that lecture I pointed out, you have to look at things not just in their tabular form. You're not just looking at single statistics, not just the average value or even its measure of spread through something like variance. You have to visualize it. You have to actually look at the details. And so a tabular version and a visual version will show you that you have, in that case, a bimodal, meaning 2 totally different experiences. That's going to happen to you if you do this quick and dirty approach. It also doesn't address the Pareto principle that one of those customers in 5, one of the 5 customers, is going to be bringing in far more value than any of the others. And that gets also just washed out in average values. Another quick way to get at this average value, and this is an estimate, again, just like the last example, those are just estimates, is to use surveys, to not even go through observational data. This is necessary if you have no historical data, or, and this is probably the more likely situation, you want to get access to it, and IT, or, when I say IT, I shouldn't just throw them under the bus. Many of my best friends are IT people. But I have seen this repeatedly where IT will stonewall requests for this, the data that would be necessary to do this. At some point, you're not going to win that battle. And you have to recognize, I'm just not going to be able to get the data that I need to calculate even the average value, let alone move beyond it to individual values. And this is where survey research tools like Qualtrics are incredibly powerful and can be used to do something very fast. I mean, surveys, I think that, well, this is actually the purpose of the lecture in December, stepping up your survey game. But I think a 30-day window is pretty realistic for getting this value through a survey. So in that 30 days, you'd have to clearly define your objectives. This is if you go back to our earlier lecture on SMART goals, SMART data goals. You need to go through that process. It should only take you a day or two to figure out what you actually need to learn. Key components of that survey, I can just tell you off the top, are going to be purchase patterns. You need to know what they're buying, the value that they typically pay, or if you can map the value based on what they tell you they buy, then you can use that from observational data. So if you have listed pricing, you can do that without having to ask on the survey, or you can ask it and validate that their memory is correct. And then the frequency of purchase. You also need loyalty metrics, likelihood to retain, which is just a question. How likely are you to continue to buy this product or service in the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years? Or understanding if it's a competitor's customer. That's one of the nice things about a survey approach is you can get data that you're never going to have internally about the lifetime value or customer value of a competitor's customer and their likelihood to churn. So loyalty is another key component that you'd want to include, and then recommendation. And I encourage you to use Net Promoter Score. It's a benchmark. NPS has been called by the author who proposed this the single metric you need to grow your business. I would abridge that and say actually CLV is far more valuable to you in understanding how to grow your business, but recommendation is the main non-monetary contribution to that. And so if you can get through the goals and writing the survey in about a week, you can field it. You do a soft launch. That's about a week. You put it in the field for maybe a week. Then you download it, you process it, you analyze it, you visualize it. within 30 days, you should be able to get to that estimated value of the average customer value or customer lifetime value. And I highly encourage you to use a strong tool like Qualtrics over something like SurveyMonkey. So whether it's the end of this week or by the end of this year, you should be able, if you don't know now, you should be able to understand your customer value and maybe even your customer lifetime value from those quick and dirty methods. But they have problems. They don't capture any of the non-monetary stuff. If it's observational data, strictly, it's not going to capture any of the non-monetary. You can get some of this through the survey. But I think you'll see once we get to the individual calculations that the average really is only a starting point, but one that you could get to quickly. Whatever marketing we've ever looked at, marketing data that we've ever looked at for any customer, word of mouth has always been the most powerful. And this is why you need to include a component of that in your customer lifetime value calculations, because there are going to be promoters. That's the secret behind the net promoter score, is you ask on a 0 to 10 scale, and then you bin everybody. You put them in buckets. Anybody who said 0 to 6 goes in the detractor bucket. Anybody who said 7 and 8 goes into the neutral or the passive, sometimes they're called. And anybody who is a 9 or a 10 is a promoter. And then what you do is you just take the proportion of promoters. So let's say 50% of them say that they're 9 or 10 of all the people you spoke with. You then take the proportion of detractors. Let's say that there was 10% who scored 0 to 6. You subtract the latter from the former, and you get a net promoter score of 40%. That is supposed to capture the average, what's happening in the aggregate out in the marketplace about people talking about you. Those who are promoting you have value to you. And if you can actually track it, so if you have an app or you have Dropbox is famous for doing this, right? They said, we will give you this much storage or this kind of a credit if you will refer us to other customers. And there was a way for them to track that. It was a great tool for them in their growth. There's a lot written about this on them, about the success of rapid growth because of this, getting customers to create more customers. Well, those initial customers are worth more to you because they've gone out and they've done some of your marketing work. And capturing that in your lifetime value calculation is important because this is, again, related to growth. If all you care about is just the value and what they're likely to purchase in the next 30 days, maybe you don't include this, but if you really want a rich value, then word of mouth needs to be included. We have a question here from Tom.
Personally, that kind of thing turns me off, but am I just an outlier, or are there other people that then are more likely to churn because they didn't like the way that they were pushed to recommend?
Okay, so that's a good question. Some people get turned off by the request to recommend the product to other people. Is that what you're saying?
Like, you'll get this if you recommend 3 people to this gym.
Okay.
And my cousins are already committed, and it just pisses me off.
Okay. Okay. That is a fair point. Recommendation programs can backfire. This is also why you want to track it. And I would say that I think a lot of anybody who's not going to recommend for you is probably one of those people who's going to be turned off by the desire to recommend or whatever incentive you offer. Some of that could be changed by the actual incentive that you offer. But what you're really trying to find are the people who are willing to recommend, who probably already are. They're brand advocates, they're ambassadors, they're out there talking about you. They're telling people, this is the best gym in the state. It has this feature that I love. It has this component that you'd love. And the reason that word of mouth is so powerful is, one, it's personal network. People distrust marketing. There's a stigma to marketing. And I would say it's actually a stigma to advertising. And digital marketing's changed this a little bit because it's possible to personalize it so much. But people don't trust brands if they've had no interaction with them or little interaction with them. They will trust them far more if someone they know who's used them recommends them. And the point of this is not to get every single person recommending. You're never going to do that, just like you're never going to stop all churn. The point is to figure out who's our promoter, and let's capture some of the value of that. Well, you're going to capture it in the revenue anyways. But let's capture it and then associate it back. And that's the purpose here of making this trackable is, okay, Tom recommended 3 people, 2 of which signed up. Tom had a 66% success rate in recommending. Someone else might have recommended 5 people and only 1 signed up. That by its own nature is different. And then, well, what was the value of each of those additional customers? Is it just we're going to assign the average value? It's $100. So every customer, our average customer value is $100. We don't know what the lifetime is going to be yet because we're not getting into predictive modeling yet. But we're going to say Tom gets a discounted version of that or discounted portion of that value. So he brought in $200. What would that have been? In a good way to compare this is to your actual cost of acquisition. What would it have cost us to acquire 2 customers? You can discount that revenue by that. You can also discount it with probabilities. You can also discount it because you don't want to assign all the value to Tom because somebody else is paying. The point is you as a customer are getting added value that's non-monetary in your transaction history that is actually contributing to revenue and profit for the organization. And knowing that means that we can treat you a little differently. We might want to encourage you to figure out, for example, what you would be motivated to recommend based on. And I'd say that most of the time that things like recommendation programs don't work, it's kind of like newsletters. The reason newsletters don't work is not necessarily because people don't like the brand, but it's they don't like the frequency with which they're being contacted. They don't like the messaging. They don't like the information. It's not necessarily a reflection on hating the brand, which I think anybody who's gone into MailChimp after an email campaign and looked at unsubscribes, their heart sinks a little bit. And that's not necessarily true. It could be they just don't like whatever it was that you tried to incentivize them with to make a recommendation. The point is, recommendations have a high value to you as an organization. An extremely high value because they're highly successful and there's really no cost other than the incentive to you for doing them.
So maybe I'm a relatively low value customer, even though they've upsold me to personal training, and I'm loyal, they're nearby, I like the trainer, so they're bringing in money from me, but I'm not making recommendations.
Yeah, and so you'd be rank order.
20%.
Yeah.
I may be above average, but not in the top 20%.
You could be in the top 20% because if you spend more as an individual customer than the additional value of a recommendation, whatever we discount that for, then you could still be a high value customer. You'd be even higher value if we could figure out how to help you recommend as well.
Okay.
But you have to be able to track this.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think just the shotgun blast of let's just ask every single customer, we'll give them a free month of our service, or we'll give them a $5 Amazon gift card, or and you just shotgun blast that to everybody, it's not going to work for the majority. And if you're not tracking it, it's a lot of wasted resources. This needs to be trackable. And for digital tools, it's a lot easier. For email campaigns, it's not that hard. Personal outreach, it's not that hard. You give people referral codes. You give people affiliate fees. That's a very popular one now is affiliate channels. So rather than individuals, it might even be other businesses that are helping you recommend. Well, you treat those businesses as a customer, but their only value to you is through affiliate recommendations. That's a totally different kind of customer value. If you just mix that in with everybody else, that's going to pull down the average a lot. So this needs to be trackable to be useful. But recommendation is the most important non-monetary component. And if all you're doing is looking at your observational transaction data and you're not doing any survey research on top of it to figure out who is who and what would they be motivated by ahead of time, I think you're going to have low success rate in actually doing this. Because you're right, there are some people who may be high value. They're buying personal training. In the case of the gym example, they've been a member forever. They come regularly. That's the next part we're going to talk about, is usage. And so they have a high value, but they are just never going to recommend. And there's nothing you can do to incentivize them to do it. And yes, you could actually push them away by hounding them for a recommendation that they're not willing to ever give. But tracking it would let you see who those people are and what does motivate them to recommend. Recommendation programs are usually handled within the customer experience groups within organizations. If that's not fully formed, or they're not willing to participate in this kind of activity where you need to really track and demonstrate outcomes, another proxy metric that you can use is just social engagement. And there are a lot of tools now that will integrate with CRMs that will track engagement. Are they a fan of you on these different platforms? Do they like your page on Facebook? Do they retweet whatever you post? Do they share stuff on LinkedIn for you? Are they engaging with your photos? How many times do they come to your website? Digital footprints, and especially social media, they're a version of word of mouth. And they're also a lot easier to measure and track than setting up recommendation programs. And so starting here and assigning, and it's totally arbitrary, what is the value of a like? What is the value of a tweet? What is the value of a photo share? You don't necessarily have to put a dollar value to it. This can be rank order. And we'll talk about RFM models and how this could be included in a minute. But the idea here is they are signaling to you as a customer that they engage and they're doing things that have a word of mouth, a digital word of mouth effect for you that do add value. It's free marketing. So you get to determine what that value would be, but this is where you can add in another layer of non-monetary, non-directly monetary value to start to parse out high likely or high value customers who are likely to help you to grow beyond their own purchases. This also needs to be trackable. So if you don't have things like Facebook pixels set up and you don't have it integrating into your CRM where you can actually track that this person shared this and then someone in their network landed on a landing page and filled out a form, and then that person went into our Salesforce, and that person got called, and that person converted to a customer, and you're not able to attribute that back to an original post or an original share, then this gets murky. You have to have the trackability set up here too. It's just a lot easier to do this because it's all digital. These platforms want you to be able to track this because they want you to see the value that they're adding, and it doesn't require you set up a program from scratch like you would with a recommendation program. And then we get to my favorite. This part makes my economist's heart sing. What people pay. So in a transactional data set, if you're looking at what someone actually paid, let's stay on the gym membership here for a moment because it's a good example. That's kind of standardized, right? Whatever, $9.99 a month, $13.99 a month, $19.99 a month. Everybody pays it. There are people who will pay that and they will go to the gym every day or 5 times a week or 3 times a week. And by the way, gyms, it's about 1 in 5 customers who actually even show up and use their membership. 80% of those people who sign up for gym memberships don't really ever use it. So are those customers actually the same? Or is there a significant enough difference that you want to understand it and then figure out who is who and then act on it? And this is where economists call it consumer surplus. But this is the value that an individual customer derives above and beyond the price they pay. So they're willing to pay even more. They don't have to because the market rate is $10 a month. But they'd be happy to pay $25 a month. They'd be happy to pay $35 a month. They don't have to. And so they derive a huge surplus of value from that. You can capture some of that surplus. This is where market differentiation, price discrimination comes in. If you can differentiate the product, bundle it, for example, you bundle the membership with training hours, then you can start to segment your market and differentiate these customers, and you can figure out who those are with higher customer surplus, and then you can start to capture it. And this is why it's non-monetary, because it doesn't show up in your transactional behavior. There's nothing that says that Tom actually values his $10 membership at $15. But if you do some survey research on top of your observational data, you can figure out willingness to pay. There's a very great survey method called discrete choice modeling. And discrete choice modeling is a form of conjoint analysis. And that analysis shows you people's preferences. And we'll talk about how preferences lead to volatility. In fact, in economics, all demand curves are derived from the intersection of the budget constraint, how much money you have and what the prices are that you have to pay, so what your income is and what the gym membership is, and then the trade-off that you're willing to give to all other commodities, and all of that's determined by your preferences. If your preferences change a lot, so some of these things, clothing seems to have a high volatility in preferences. Most people don't like wearing clothes that they wore 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. With music, videos, some of these markets have high volatility tied to fleeting consumer preferences. If you can understand those, you can add a layer of data to your transactions that you're never going to pull out, ever, from just historical transaction data. And what it will show you is, hey, Tom is actually a potentially much higher valuable customer if we can capture some of his surplus, which you'd happily give if we can offer you something that's different. The airlines just bungled this one. Right? They figured out that they could use cookies and website behavior to figure out how to get you to pay more for the same exact commodity. And when people figured out that was happening, there was a revolt. In fact, there's that, I think he went to jail, that kid who figured out that you could game this system by, I can't remember what the term is right now, but the FAA got involved. He figured out that the way that these airlines were doing this pricing, if you actually wanted to go to Chicago, but you booked a flight to Boston that had a stopover in Chicago, it was cheaper for you. And so he built a website that allowed you to do this, and they shut him down. So people don't like, and this gets into economics, the price discrimination is what this is based on. And there's 3 ways to price discriminate in economics. One is you charge every single person their absolute willingness to pay for the same product. And that's what the airlines are trying to do. They're trying to say, yeah, you're willing to pay $100 more than somebody else because you're a business customer. You're not as sensitive. Your price elasticity is not as high as a vacationer who can pick a different week if they want based on price. And people don't seem to like that one because it's the same commodity and they're being asked to pay a different price. It doesn't seem fair to most people. Then there's the other approach, another approach, which is second-degree price discrimination. Well, you bulk purchase. It's the Costco model. You get people to show their willingness to pay by buying in different quantities for discounts. And actually, Costco uses something else called the 2-part tariff. You pay to be a member, and then you have to buy in bulk to get the discounts. And then you have third-degree price discrimination, which is you just segment markets. And that's the one that people are fine with most of the time. It can be a geographical segmentation. You charge people in Dallas a different price than you charge people in San Francisco. Or you charge people in the United States a different price than you charge in another country. So I use this example in my economic history classes. I show them a textbook, the textbook we actually use in the class. And if you buy it on Amazon, it's about $280. If you go buy it online from a website that's in India, same exact textbook, except it's stamped on the inside cover and it says not for sale in the United States, but FedEx will bring it to you anyways. It's only about $89. That's just market segmentation. And that was based on the assumption that you couldn't commit arbitrage. You couldn't go to India and buy suitcases of books and bring them to the United States and sell them and undercut. And pharmacy companies or pharmacological companies have had a hard time with this, charging one price in one country, another price in another country. When the higher paying country figures it out, they get very upset. There was actually another young entrepreneurial individual who was bringing suitcases of textbooks back from India, and that person was prosecuted. So third-degree price discrimination is the most common, whether it's geographical segmentation or it's behavioral or it's the product. Sometimes you can change the product. That segmenting seems to be the one the market is willing to accept, and it allows you to capture the consumer surplus. So you have to do things to realize that additional value increase. But it is possible to do if you know who has higher willingness to pay, lower elasticity of demand, meaning they're not going to change the amount that they demand given a huge price change. And then that allows you to start to segment them out, to start to figure out how to add value that would allow them to be charged a different price, and then you can capture this. So knowing the average as a benchmark and then starting to include some of these non-monetary things moves you in the direction toward individual customer lifetime value. And this is where you really get the payoff from marketing optimization. If I know you're a $100 customer instead of a $10 customer, my cost of acquisition strategy for you has to change. Because if I can get you for $5, great. But if it actually takes $20 to get you as a customer, the profit margin on that is so much larger than I pay $5 and I don't get you at all. What I get are people who are worth $6 every time or $7 every time. You can't do that without understanding the individual customer lifetime value. And this is also where the trackability of the data through your CRM is really important. Taking marketing data and passing it through sales into the financial data, and the CRM seems to be the linchpin that everybody's using right now. This is also where sales prioritization happens. If I know that you are a higher likely to buy, that you have a higher likelihood to buy, and that the value of your purchase is much higher, so the expected probability of the value of your purchase is much higher individually, I can change my sales strategy and should change my sales strategy accordingly. This is also where churn comes in. Who's worth trying to retain and who is not? You're never going to be able to do that. You're just guessing if you're using the average. And this is where you do have to step up your analytical game, because if this was easy, everybody would do it. Right? If this was the easiest thing to calculate, people would know this, and all of their marketing would be individualized and based on individual customer lifetime value. You also need this information to do real segmentation. And I'm going to show 2 case studies here at the end of really advanced approaches to customer lifetime value calculation. And I still think that their fundamental flaw is they start with observational data. They don't start with modeling customer preferences and then look at how that maps to all their observational data. They do it in the reverse. So we hear this all the time. People will say, oh, we've already segmented. And we say, oh, how did you segment them? Oh, well, we looked at people who only ever purchased once. So, well, why did you do that? Instead, well, they're different. They're fundamentally different than people who repeatedly purchase. And that's true if you're driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. That's not true if you're trying to understand, well, what would have made a one-time purchase customer into a two-time purchase customer? Maybe a lot of them churned out before a second purchase because they didn't like the follow-up emails, or you hit them with a recommendation program and they didn't feel like it was a good idea. You miss that ability to segment in a really actionable way by starting with observational data and not starting with primary research data. CLV is also a really great way to look at persona development, understanding the highest value personas. This is where if you do have to use just your observational data, at a minimum, figure out the Pareto persona and then map that to everything you know about them, what channel they were acquired over, what messaging worked with them, what price they've paid over time. And once you have, the nice thing about an individual value is you can test and iterate and validate over time. With the average, it's a lot harder because, again, you could have a bimodal pattern happening in your data and not know it. And it looks like it's steady, and that's not what's happening at all. There could be quite a bit of chaos. You're losing a lot of high-end customers and getting a lot of low-end customers. We heard this with a B2B customer recently who, their goal was to aim, amazing revenue growth, by the way, just amazing. And the kind of stuff that 200 years ago would have gotten you hauled in front of a magistrate. Like, how did you possibly get a 50% profit rate? And that's wonderful, and they're very excited. But as they started to dig in their data, they realized we're not hitting the tier of the market we were actually after. We were going after the enterprise. We really captured a lot of the mid-market. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They just need to understand it. Well, if they're only looking at the average and they're only looking at the revenue over time, they don't know that. They don't see that in that data. And so to be able to do really good persona development and segmentation, you have to move down to individual values. And I think understanding customers and the preferences is the better starting point than just mining through historical data. But let's go through the key components of any individual level CLV calculation are going to have these three pieces: recency, frequency, and monetary value. If you look down the left corner, there is a source for the data scientists who've joined us, or the programmers. Some of you are programmers. This is an R package that you can just go download and use. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at recency. It's going to say one column is going to be based on the recency of purchases. And there's ways to avoid things like purchase in the last day of the month, manipulating your data, so you can look at every single day of the year. But that column shows the recency, and it will sort customers into either quartiles or quintiles. You get to decide. You can even do it on 100 points. And often in RFM models, which is what these are usually called, an individual customer will be given a score, a letter grade. So if you are in the highest quartile or quintile, you get an A. You've purchased very recently compared to everybody else. If you're in the next quartile or quintile below, you get a B. And the pattern goes on, A, B, C, D, E, to however you want to divide up the sorted list based on how recently they've purchased. That's one column. Then you have another column. Okay, well, you purchased recently, but do you purchase frequently? And same thing, you sort that column and you assign a value or a score, A, B, C, D, based on the quartiles or quintiles or whatever sorting method you use. And then you do the same thing for the monetary value. What was the actual value of these purchases, or the lifetime of these purchases if you're including frequency? And then it's just like a bond measurement. You're looking for somebody that has a AAA rating. They purchase recently, they purchase often, and they have a high value when they purchase. That's your golden ticket customer. Build your initial persona around them if this is the model you want to use. It does not include any non-monetary metrics. And so RFM models can be improved significantly with non-monetary things like willingness to recommend or high consumer surplus. And by the way, I didn't mention this on the consumer surplus slide, but another really useful, a really actionable use of consumer surplus measures is likelihood to churn. Because if you, Tom, really value your gym membership above the price you pay, then the cost to you of leaving is actually higher than somebody else who's right there on the margin. If it's worth $10 to me and I'm paying $10 and it goes up to $11, I'm likely to churn if the value is only $10. If I value it at $35 and it goes from $10 to $11 to $12, I'm very unlikely to churn because I'm still deriving a lot of value above and beyond the price I'm paying. And so RFM models can be improved by just including a couple of these non-monetary things like recommendation. Add another column. Are they likely to recommend? You can do the same thing. How recently have they recommended? How frequently do they recommend? What's been the monetary value of that recommendation? You can do a two-stage RFM model where you look at the traditional RFM for them as an individual customer, and then you look at the RFM related to their recommendations. And then you can use consumer surplus or some other metric, including survey research about the likelihood to churn or a predicted value of their likelihood to churn. And you can include that, and then you can have a AAA score that also includes those other two additional pieces. And what you're doing is you're just getting more refined in your understanding of customers and their individual values. So you can go to that R. R is open source. For those who don't know what R is or have only heard it in passing, R is a pseudo-programming language. It's mostly built around statistical analysis, but it can do some automation. It's not great for automation at scale. If you're looking for something to plug into a process that's going to run terabytes or petabytes of data every day, R is probably not your tool. You might want to look at Python. But both R and Python are open source and free. They have huge communities that support them. People just write these packages and put them out there for you to use. And this is a huge cost saver for you to use open source tools like R or Python instead of doing something like SPSS or SAS or Stata or Statistica. And their benefit over something like Excel is R could be programmed to grab your data from your marketing channels, from your CRM. It can be programmed to process it, transform it, clean it, and then run this model every single day and push it into a free dashboard. There's environment tool called RStudio. And the makers of RStudio also make a tool called RShiny. And if you're using something like Domo or Power BI or any of these pay-for dashboard tools, RShiny, if you have a little bit of programming skill, can save you a lot of money. And it can do the same thing. And they can be interactive. All open source, all free. You can go to that link and you can have this model and start running this by the end of next week. As far as timelines, because everybody always asks us this, how fast? Everybody wants it yesterday. Realistically, I think anything that's going to be done from a real individual predictive modeling basis, and I'll show you some examples here in a moment, some case studies. Anything that's been done in less than 90 days, either you have a genius on your hands or you didn't go deep enough. Anything that takes longer than 90 days, and you've got some inefficiencies in your organization that you need to look into. And this can be complicated by data prepping, cleaning, and transforming. And so I put up there usable data in hand, because agreeing to do a CLV project and then expecting it to be delivered in 90 days is unrealistic unless your data is ready to go right now. And 50%, we've surveyed data scientists for a course I taught about a year ago. We did survey research with Qualtrics. We found data scientists at organizations all over the United States. We did in-depth interviews with those individual data scientists. And one of the most surprising findings that popped out, and I love doing qualitative research because these kinds of findings just pop out within the first 5 interviews. And then you can just validate, you continue to do more interviews, you keep hearing the same thing. But one of the surprising things that we heard was that data prep and cleaning is 50% of their time. Data scientists say half of your time is going to be around just getting the data ready to run your models. And so even if they've got usable data in hand, for 30 days, they're going to be manipulating that data, transforming it to get it to fit into their model assumptions, calibrating it, and then they'll spend a month running the model, maybe another month validating it. And within 90 days, you should have something to start to use. And this is individual customer lifetime value. This is not just customer value, like I said, about just going and getting your revenue and your total customers and dividing it. This is a real model, whether it's RFM or it's RFM plus non-monetary components. This is stuff that you're going to be able to look at individuals, predict their future values, and then validate and see if they're working. But 90 days is a good benchmark. The R and the F from RFM models have been used to also look at churn. So buy till you die, here's another free R package. If you go to the source, that's down in the bottom left. This incorporates recency and frequency to build a predictive model for churn. So this gives you lifetime, and that's the point. Historical data, you can see people who've lived and died, customers who've lived and died in your historical data. You can say, look, we're just going to look to date and say we've had 10 years of data, and in those 10 years, our customers on average survive for 5 years. And there's a hazard modeling, I didn't put this in, and maybe I should have. Hazard modeling is a really good predictive method for survival analysis using historical data, because it assigns a probability of being alive, of surviving in the next target time period. Buy till you die is not a hazard model as far as I understand. I don't believe it is. I could be wrong. If you figure it out and you send me an email and you say, Luciano, you are wrong, I will send you a $25 Amazon gift card. It's a far more intense version of churn modeling than just this buy till you die package, which basically just uses recency and frequency to say, if we're going to model from the last 3 years, and we're going to predict the next 2 years or the next year, what is the probability, and that's what it does, is it gives you a probability that this customer will churn out in that period, in that target period. And the reason you want this value is it doesn't just give you a death date of ongoing living customers right now. It allows you to prioritize churn prevention. Right? If you see somebody who's likely to churn in the next 30 days and you look at them and they're a high value customer, you can intervene. You can also use this churn probability to find expected value instead of just, hey, we think Tom's going to buy 5 more things in the next year, 5 more months of membership. It's, well, the value of that 5 more months of membership is only $50, but if there's a 50% chance that Tom's going to churn in that 5-month window, then it's really only worth $25 to us right now. And this is where expected value, this is one of the differences between models that are highly predictive and models that fail, is you incorporate the probabilities of expected outcomes, which requires you actually do some predictive modeling. Whether you're using RFM, buy till you die, hazard modeling, just straight regression analysis, whatever you do, you need to get into the mentality that analytics is it's like agile work. It's something you're going to do, test, validate, and repeat. It's not a one and done. You're not going to build this model once and use it forever. It will depend, really, the usefulness, the staleness of this data really comes down to the lifetime of your customer. If your customer lifetime is 5 years, running this model every single day might not make sense. Refreshing the model every single day probably doesn't make sense. If in order to validate that you've predicted a purchase value for someone whose sales cycle is a year, that test might take a year. It might even take 2 years for you to get good data to validate. I think this is another reason why the e-commerce companies have pioneered or pushed the frontier, I should say, of this metric, because the recency and frequency of their customers is very, very short-lived. It's not like a car that you're buying every 5 to 7 years on average. You're buying clothes every season. You might even be buying stuff every month. If you're an Amazon customer, you might be buying multiple times a day. So you have to know, this gets back to knowing your industry, you have to set these tests up correctly. If you're going to use 3 years of data to model the next 3 months, and you wouldn't actually expect for anything to change in those 3 months, and so you run the test, you're like, yeah, it worked for these 3 months and nothing's really changed, we're going ahead with this model, you might discover 9 months from now that the model starts to break down, and it's not necessarily the fault of the model. It might be because you didn't have the right time horizons in your mind for this test, validate, repeat process. Another thing that changes this is the volatility of individual preferences. If you're in a market, so if you have really volatile profit margins, that's a sign that you're in a market that's volatile based around customer preferences that change a lot. And the best description that I've heard for volatility and preferences, because if you go back to economics and you're looking at demand curves and you're looking at how they're derived from that intersection of utility surfaces with budget constraints shaped by people's preferences, it's basically like mountain climbing. The utility idea in economics is that the higher you go, the better you are. And it's just like a mountain. There's a summit. It's called the bliss point. You can't get any higher than that. Everywhere from there is down. And customers want to go up the mountain. They get more pleasure by consuming more. They're only stopped by their budget. And what will happen is when they get to some high level point where they can't go any higher, what they can do is substitute. They can basically, it's like if you've looked at topographical maps. It's like getting onto one of those ISO curves or a topographical map. You're at a certain altitude and you can go left on the mountain or right on the mountain, but you're not going any higher up. You're not actually getting better off. Now imagine climbing a mountain made out of water beds. That's what it's like to try to estimate volatile preferences. And so you will have to refresh that kind of model probably daily, and that's why a lot of the e-commerce companies will do that. In fact, let's talk about the first of 2 case studies, and then we're done. I didn't do it. I still didn't stay under an hour, it looks like. So Groupon used, there's 2 case studies I'm going to talk about. The first one's Groupon. I'm sure everybody knows who Groupon is. Many of you may have used Groupon. This is a really good example, the first of 2, of a highly thought out data science approach to doing individual customer lifetime value assessments. And it was 2 stages. So they were using random forests. So if you don't know what random forests are, they're built on decision trees. You can look it up. But they did this to predefine purchasing cohorts. So rather than just arbitrarily say people who purchase once or purchase twice, they did try to predict the differences within individual customers. And that was to figure out whether that individual was likely to purchase in a target time window. And then once they had that, that's back to the churn, the second stage predicted a dollar value for those people. So how likely are they to use Groupon in the next month, 2 months, 5 months? And in that window, how much are they likely to spend? And they use that to get those expected values. And the paper's there, you can go read it. They published everything they did in that source that's listed in the bottom left, an engagement-based customer lifetime value system for e-commerce. Word on the street is this model does not exist anymore, that they've moved on to another model. That's again a sign that these models do not last forever. But their predictions were being updated daily. Okay, so they're taking new data, they're plugging it into the model that exists, and they're getting new predicted values every single day. And then every 90 days, every quarter, they're taking all their data and they're retraining their model. And that means that they're changing the betas within the model. Maybe even the model functional form. What variables are being included? What transformations of those variables are included? What type of model? Maybe it's not random forest the next time. Maybe they actually go down the deep learning path in future models. The point is they're updating every day based on what they see is happening, because Groupon is one of those very short sales cycles. I don't actually know what the average time length is for a Groupon deal, but I think it's pretty low. I think it's weeks at most. And then they're taking that data and making new predictions on a daily basis, which means they have to run all that data through their model every night. And then every 90 days, every quarter, they're then taking all the data from that and their historical data, and they're retraining a new model and doing the same thing. This is a heavy data science approach. It takes a data scientist. There's a couple components to this. One, you have to have a good statistician type data scientist. So if you go look at our Creating a Data Culture at Your Organization lecture, which is available on our YouTube page right now, you will see the different types of data scientists. This would be the data wrangler, as I defined them in there. This is the individual who might have a PhD in something like economics, physics, psychology. They're really good with statistical analysis. And it requires that kind of a mind to create the model. But then from an engineering standpoint, you really need people who are capable of programming something to run every night, to pull data from a database, to transform that data, to then put into the model that the statistician created, and then put the output back into a database that's useful for the rest of the organization. Those are two very different types of roles. So this requires a team, which is the lesson of that whole lecture on creating a data culture. And it requires skill sets that are not often found in a single individual. But they're able to look at that value daily. What is Tom worth today? If every time you walked in your gym and scanned your barcode and they saw your value and they could see that you were on the increase, they could potentially do some things that keep you going. Versus if they see that your likelihood to churn, like this is maybe the last time you're ever likely to come to the gym, they might be able to intervene. The second example is from ASOS. So they're also an e-commerce clothing company. They also use random forest. Random forest seems to be the nice balancing point between, and if you go read this paper about another sources there, customer lifetime value prediction, using embeddings, random forest seems to perform predictively well enough, and it's scalable enough to justify using it over other approaches. So in this paper, they also talk about the fact they tried to go down the deep neural net approach. They tried to use deep learning. And for those who don't know what deep learning is, I'd encourage you to go read about it. You've probably heard about AI right now, and you've heard about machine learning. It's just that process with more data and more hidden layers. It's just and it requires a lot of data, by the way, to do this. To get highly, highly predictable outcomes. And what they found, they were converting their data into an image. If I remember the details of the paper correctly, and it's been a little while since I read it, they were converting all of their data into visual images, and then they were running image recognition deep learning on those to find patterns that they just couldn't see in the data themselves. And what they found was that the added value, predicted value of that process did not justify all the engineering problems that come with running deep neural nets. They require different kinds of processing, they require different kinds of forms, different tools, the costs are much higher, and they figured out that random forest was doing just fine. But they also followed a multiple stage approach here. They were first trying to predict whether an individual was going to purchase in that target window, and they, by the way, mentioned the Groupon paper. They read the Groupon paper, they learned from that, and then they added their own flavor to it. And they were trying to figure out a percentile value, so they didn't assign they weren't looking at just the individual values because this is subject to a lot of outlier problems. If you have one person who's just buying compulsively on your site all day, that can really leverage your model. So what they did instead was they were putting it in percentiles. And this is a calibration approach where you predetermine classifications and then you predict likely memberships of those classifications among individuals. And you can calibrate your model that way. That's opposed to the other way of calibrating a model where you predetermine your left side variable, your predicted value, and you basically adjust your beta weights until you get the accurate prediction each time. And then there's even a third calibration approach, which is based on Bayesian stuff. So be careful when you see the word calibration, you need to dig into what they're doing. And then they just used the straight logistic regression, very simplistic regression, for the churn prediction. And then they took a decision tree and they said, okay, given the likelihood to churn and the likelihood to purchase in this window, what's the value that we're predicting for them? And this was being repeated on a daily basis. When they went to the deep neural net approach, what they were trying to do was understand website behavior. So I believe that was the data that they converted to images to find embeddings or variables, patterns that were affecting this that they didn't see in their other data. And they tried to use that to improve the churn predictions. And like I said, the conclusion was, no, the logistic and the random forest together seem to be working just fine and they're much more scalable. So I'd encourage you this week, for those who don't have the value, go figure out just your average customer value. In the next month, before the end of the year, if you've got budget, go talk to Qualtrics. If you want to talk to Qualtrics, go through us. We're partners with Qualtrics. We can get you a better deal than you'll get on the market. Go talk to them. Get a survey fielded quickly. Get a baseline so that you're starting 2018 understanding at least that average value and some of the non-monetary things that you could get from a survey. If you've already got that information, or you're sitting on really good transactional information, a lot of historical data that's really rich, that includes a lot of the marketing. I mean, look at why ASOS was trying to use website behavior to understand a way to differentiate the customer lifetime value, because you will hit a wall with the individual calculations if all you're doing is looking at transaction data. But within 90 days, if that data is ready to go, by the end of January, early February, you could have a model in place that you are testing and iterating and improving on all throughout 2018. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them now. I think we've hit the hour mark. For those who need to leave, I appreciate you attending today. Next month, our next lecture will be specifically about survey research. We'll talk about customer lifetime value within it, but this is really about survey research methods. And what I've found, and the reason we're going to end the year with this subject, is that there's really a chasm opening up right now in organizations where either they are only doing survey-based primary research, and even when they're doing that, they're not doing it well. Just, I would say 90% of people who field a survey, I get the kind of emails, Tom, you were talking about. I get the kind of emails where people send me just surveys and I just look at them and I think, this isn't egregious. And I won't complete it as a result. And it probably costs a lot of money, and it's very ineffective. And that's as far as a lot of organizations are going at all. Or they do no primary research whatsoever, and they only dig in and they hire data scientists, and they build these huge teams that have 3 engineers and 2 PhDs in statistics and 10 analysts. And all they do is they just dig and dig and dig into their observational data, and they create these black box models that they can't explain to decision makers. And I don't know why this chasm exists. And there's like real animosity between market researchers and data scientists about the value of their tools and the uselessness of the other. And they're not mutually exclusive. You should be using them as complementary things. And it's not actually that hard to program a good survey. And there's just some basic principles about the programming of the survey itself, how you do the layout, how you write the questions, how you group the questions. And then there's the more advanced stuff of how do you start to use display logic and skip logic, and how do you create a survey that can capture 4 different groups. If you know somebody's a non-customer, don't make them go through the same survey. Skip them into a block of questions that's just specifically about non-customers. Then put them back into the end of the survey and capture their demographics and some other targetable things, maybe some marketing patterns, channels, and tools that they use. That gets to the bigger survey flow. And then there's the actual fielding and administration of surveys. People I don't know why, they don't do soft launches. It's a big mistake. They don't do pre-tests. That's a big mistake. And the end result is that most survey data that I've seen is pretty bad and pretty useless. And it doesn't have to be that way at all. And for those people who are only digging in with data science approaches and they're just looking at transactional data all day long, there's a moment where you'll just stare at something. And this is why I think that most data scientists fail to explain this successfully to decision makers. You're just staring at it, and there's no amount of inferring on your part that will ever get you to understand why you're seeing the pattern you're seeing. And that's where primary research is quick and easy and gives you powerful evidence to support what you're seeing in the observational outcomes. So that will be Thursday, December 14th, same time, 10 a.m. The updated landing page will be up in about an hour, and you can re-register for that one if you'd like to attend. For those who have additional questions, as I said, I'll stick around. Kathy, you are very welcome. I just got a comment in the chat window. I hope others will continue to join us. It seems to be building. This has been great momentum to watch each of these lectures have more and more participants. I'm also happy to take questions by email, luciano@emperitas.com. Tom, you got a question?
If you have survey data from a certain percentage of your customers, but how do you do individualized stuff for all of the people who
Great question. This is where sampling methodology comes in. So what you have to do is you have to figure out, this is like, what do they call it? I'm blanking on the lookalike modeling. So what you do is you use some observational data to figure out who you're going to go target for survey research. Then you go and you conduct the survey research and you map those results back to the observational data. So what are the patterns that you saw that you can link between them? And then from those 2 pieces, you then do the lookalike. You say, these 5 people, Tom said this on the survey. Tom looks like this in our data. We're going to test if what we heard from Tom in his survey works for Ben, who looks like Tom in our data. And then that's where the test validate comes in. So we've had customers, clients I should say, who've come to us who have surveyed half of their customer base. I mean, we're talking millions of people. In survey research, this came up, I believe, last lecture. You really don't need or necessarily want to go above 10%. The question is, do you just grab 10% randomly from your customer base, look at their survey responses, and then look at their observational data, and then do lookalike modeling, which is a fast and easy way to go about it. I think it misses some of the value that you can get out of the observational data. You don't have to guess at all this stuff. You've already got some information on these individuals. That's not true, by the way, for competitors' customers. If you're going to go try to, and I didn't bring this up And again, this is something maybe we should have talked about a little bit more. But another thing that's really helpful to understand is not just your customer lifetime value, but your competitors. You're never going to get your hands, unless you do some dark web shady stuff, you're not going to get your hands on your competitors' transactional observational data. You can easily get a hold of your competitors' customers and survey them and get that average estimate or even some indication of segments to compare against yourself. And when you do that, I would encourage you to do the study blind so that the people you are surveying don't know that it's you, and ask questions about yourself. And so you'll get your customers and your competitors' customers, and then you can validate the accuracy of what you're hearing in the survey overall by looking at, here's what our customers actually said. We know who these individuals are. Let's go look at our observational data. How accurate were they? Are they accurate 80% of the time, 70% of the time? And if that's true of our customers, then we might want to discount what we're hearing about our competitors as well. So survey can be such a powerful layer to add on top of all that observational data. But you have to sample. Unless you're going to go the census route where you're going to get every single customer that you have right now and you're going to try to get them all to take a survey. And that's not hard. B2B customers, clients, if you're a B2B organization, that might be easier than if you're a B2C. I don't think Groupon, no matter what they ever do, is going to talk to 100% of customers that have used them. They get 30 million unique visitors a month, I believe, to their website. I don't think they're going to get a survey program in place that's going to capture 30 million responses every single month. And even if they did, well, what about the customers in the future? That's a different group. So you'd have to use it's not really census data. You're not capturing every single customer. You'd still have to make statistically inferential statements about those future customers based on it. So if that's the case, then start small. Stay under 10%. And this gets to the sampling with or without replacement that, like I said, I'm pretty sure we talked about that last month at the lecture. That you start, if you have 100 people in your survey, so you use Qualtrics, you upload 100 people into your list, and you say, we just want 20 people randomly. And every time that you contact someone, you put them back into the list. That's sampling with replacement. So you could end up getting 3 surveys just because your number was randomly called. Well, you're not going to take the second, let alone the 3rd survey. But the con of doing sampling without replacement is that your probability of getting a survey randomly out of 1 of 100 really starts to change when now you're only 1 out of 90. So if we picked the first 10, then your probability of being the 11th person is 1 out of 90, not 1 out of 100. And that problem gets worse as you go down the list. I still think that sampling without replacement is the approach you should follow. I think it's, while it may not be theoretically ideal, it is practically ideal because you're not going to get somebody to take the same survey 2-3 times. And if you're going to do that, then just stay under 10% of your customers and make sure that you have as random as possible 10%, and then take their survey responses, look at their observational data, then do lookalike, and then validate. And if the validations are far off, go back to your survey. Take another sample of 10% randomly. And you may want to exclude the other 10% that you had. Depends on the timeline. I think a lot of organizations shoot themselves in the foot with surveys, especially net promoter surveys, where they'll send it out every 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. Even if it's just one survey question, people get survey fatigue quickly. And you have to remember that, just look at your own inbox. How many survey requests do you get in a year? You're not just competing for your customers' time within your own surveys, or you might have multiple departments in your company. This is another thing that happens. Qualtrics actually had to build a tool to help stop this, and it's called the Qualtrics panel, that you put everybody that you're going to potentially ever want to contact into that panel, and it tracks who's been contacted when, with what surveys, and that really helps so that you don't get a customer who's been hit with a marketing department survey, and then a sales department survey, and then your customer lifetime value data science team survey, and then they're getting net promoter 4 times automatically every year because it goes out every quarter. And they're like, why am I getting 7 surveys from this company? Other questions? Aren't you basically tying population to sampling frames? This is a question from Derek. Well, yeah, that's the point of the sampling frame, is to understand the population. That's the group that you're making the inference from. So you have to remember, and this is definitely in our Interpreting Data Like a Pro lecture, an average value based on a sample is a point estimate. So let's say that I do a Net Promoter Score question, 0 to 10, and I get a 5. That's an estimate, because if I ran the sample, if I had the same, and the assumption is the same number, so if I had another 100 people that I randomly sampled, and I surveyed them, and then I did that an infinite amount of times, that what I would get around that point estimate, because the point estimate's going to change every time. It's going to go from 5 to 6 to 5.5 to 7. If I did that an infinite amount of times using the same number of respondents each time, you get an interval, and this is the confidence interval. It's built on the variance. And it's really within that interval, your value can fall anywhere within that interval 95 out of 100 times in that process. That's what that 95% confidence interval means. It doesn't mean that your average value is correct. It doesn't mean that you've captured it correctly. It means that 95 out of 100 times you're doing that with a sample, that sample average, that interval will capture a value that is correct for the population. It is the real population value. There's great YouTube simulation videos of people running these tests iteratively. This has been one of the powerful things about computers, that you can just run these iterative tests and validate this yourself. But there's nothing that tells you that you're not the 1 in the 100 chance, or in the case of a 95% confidence interval, the 1 in 20 chance that the value you got, the interval you got, and the value that it's built around doesn't actually capture the true population value. And so, yes, you are using a sample frame to try to understand the population. There's no guarantee that you do it correctly. This is, again, why testing and iterating is so key. Because if you run the survey 3 times with 3 different randomized groups of people, and you're getting pretty accurate or pretty consistent values for both the average and the intervals, that's when you start to have strong evidence that you're not, because you would have had to get, the probability that is so low, you'd have to have gotten the sample wrong 3 times in a row. That's a joint probability issue. So the joint probability there was the 1 in 20 the first time, and the 1 in 20 again the second time, and the 1 in 20 the third time, or if you want to use the 100%, so you got like there's 5 out of 100, that you got 3 of those 5 back to back to back, and you're just not even close to the actual value, is so low statistically. There's nothing that says that didn't happen. It absolutely could happen. And that's the danger of using sampling to try to understand the population. But you're back to the practical reality of the situation. You're not going to interview every single person. If you did, you'd just have census data, and whatever you calculate as the average, that's it. That's the true value. But you're just never going to do that. And if your product is, if you're trying to do something that's maybe destructive testing of a physical product, you wouldn't destroy every single product to validate its tolerance, or you'd have nothing left to sell. So sampling is something you have to embrace. It's something that can be, the shortcomings of it can be fixed by doing sampling without replacement, small batch, repeat process, continued validation, and I think really understanding who the population is that you're trying to define. But yes, that is what the survey research through sampling does. Other questions? Do you have an outline to break down CLV by each vertical or industry, especially concerning the consumer surplus and elasticities of word of mouth? So this was from Lindsay. Do you have an outline to break down CLV? I'm not sure I totally understand this question, so let me try to answer it. I think what's being asked here is, do I have a existing outline of how to, like something I could give you about how to do this for each vertical or industry? I don't have something right now that I could point you to that would say, just go do this given your vertical or your industry. I do think that knowing your industry changes a lot about customer value and how you're going to go about figuring it out. B2B versus B2C is the most immediate. That's the first big differentiation. I think that if you're in a B2C situation, the customer is usually an individual. If you're in a B2B situation, the customer is an organization, but the buyer, decider, and user might be 3 different people, and they might be answering to a committee that has 10 people on it. And so you can assign all of this stuff to an individual client, but understanding what's motivating it is built on 10 actual humans, and that introduces a lot of volatility. That's one of the first differentiations that I think you have to be aware of. Are you a B2B or a B2C, or are you both? And if you're both, then you definitely want to segment right from that point and treat them differently. So banking is a good example about this. Right? Emperitas has an account with a bank. I personally have an account with that same bank. So if I get a survey, or if someone's looking at me as an individual and they're trying to calculate my value, and they don't make a differentiation just because my name's on both, of one being a consumer account and one being a business account, and they're mingling those, that's a mistake. Because they're just going to behave very differently. And this is where theory can play a big role. I don't think that you should go blindly into data, into observational data, and just say whatever outcome we get is what it is happening. I think one of the lessons of both the ASOS and the Groupon case studies is that they put a lot of time into thinking about how should we set up the stages of this analysis by looking at differences in people. And some of it is by using actual predictive modeling. I don't know that that businesses have a separate Groupon account. Amazon does. We have a separate Amazon account that's different than my personal account, and it actually behaves differently. Okay, well then look at those two markets differently because they're clearly different. You have different products for them. Then within that, verticals and industries, some are much harder than others. Banking and finance is one that's really complicated because it's not just the product itself that changes so much. I mean, I can have as an individual, let's just stick with the individual example, I can have an individual checking account. I can have an individual savings account. I can have a student loan, a house loan, a construction loan. I can have a CD. I can have an IRA. I can have a Roth. I can have credit cards. I can have what other instruments? I mean, the list of possible, I think they call them instruments is the official term. The list of products that I can have are different, and how the banks make money on them is different. Some is just a straight up fee. You're just going to pay to have that account. It's $15 a month. That's just the fee. But we'll waive it if you have a certain balance in your account. Okay, well, why? Well, because the bank makes money on the deposits. So now the amount of deposits contributes to the customer lifetime value. Well, what about my credit card? The value that the bank derives from the credit card is built on 2 things: my usage of it and my interest rate. That also is different as an interest rate than my mortgage, or my car loan, or my student loans. Or another source of revenue that's just been growing for banks are fees. Well, what types of fees? Late fees, insufficient fund fees, fees to do a wire transfer, fees to get a cashier's check, counter checks. Banks have one of the most diverse offerings as far as products, and calculating that value gets very hard. And I don't think that you can actually do that very successfully with a survey unless you just figure out what people have, and then you have to start to use, because you're never going to ask them. No one's going to answer on your survey, by the way, what their interest rates are, or maybe give you their credit score so you could figure it out. Socially stigmatized, and we'll talk about this next month, socially stigmatized questions like things around fees by themselves usually imply you did something wrong. So getting people to honestly give you feedback about that through survey is difficult. Instead, you can understand what products they have and then use industry averages, or even better yet, you can look at what products they have, look at what products they've actually got in your observational data, compare the two between the survey and the observational data, and then know from your own internal accounting, this is how much each of those things gives. What is the actual value of a deposit? How much is being earned on these different interest rates given the average spend on a credit card and the repayment on student loans or mortgages? Banks in particular, this is a hard thing to do. With e-commerce, it's a lot easier because it's very easy to figure out, even if you have lots of products. I mean, Amazon has, I don't even know how many products. It's not that hard, though, for them to figure out what that product was, who bought it, what they paid, if they keep repeat buying it, if they're likely to buy it again in the future. And this is where Amazon used data brilliantly. They even moved beyond to a part of value that we didn't really talk about, which was all the upselling through recommendations. If you can really start to understand somebody's preferences individually as a customer, you can then start to test product upsells and see what they actually buy. Predict it. Is Tom likely to buy professional services or training at the gym? Yes, no, that's a logit outcome. Yes or no? He is. In the next 3 months, yes or no? And then we offer it to him and he buys it. Or maybe we don't even offer it to him, we just see. Is he likely to buy without any offer? No, he didn't. Okay, maybe our model was not right. What happens if we incentivize him? Oh, then he did buy. Okay, well, and if he bought that, maybe he'll really like a 5 coupon book for the gym nutrition counter, right? And now we make that recommendation. This is where the lookalike recommender engines can be built on a lot of this data too. We didn't really hit on that very much because the first step is just getting to the actual customer lifetime value of the individual. Upsell opportunities beyond their own willingness to pay for those products, you can build a lot of that information on other people like Tom who've made other similar purchases, and that's where recommender engines are just great. Other questions? Okay, it looks like that's it for today. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I hope I'll see you on Thursday, December 14th, for our next lecture in this series, Step Up Your Survey Research. Have a great day.